Hello everyone and welcome to today's SANS webcast. Top Office 365 Mail Vulnerabilities. Attacks on your users right now. Sponsored by Avanan. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Michael Landewe, Avanan co-founder, and Kip James, CISO Security Researcher at Avanan. I would also like to welcome Stephen Toole, Chief Marketing Officer for Avanan, who will be handling the Q&A. If during the webcast you have any questions for Michael or Kip, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface. We will be answering them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Michael.
Thank you, Carol. Again, my name is Michael Landewe, co-founder at Avanan, and today we're going to spend some time with Kip James, who is a CISO for multiple companies as well as a security researcher. He has been in the security industry for a few decades, in fact, starting his career as an information systems management office for the U.S. Marines. He's spent a lot of time in government service for NORAD, eventually moving to the private industry as a CISO of the United Launch Alliance. He has been a SOX compliance director for one of the largest corporations, conglomerates in the world, as well as CISO for GOI, and most recently CISO for ServiceSource. What's not mentioned is that he's also been a security consultant for a number of organizations, interim CISOs for a number of organizations, and things that I can mention, but he's probably very proud of, is a number of commendation medals in his time in the military for his work in security technology and process improvement. 2 Navy commendations, 2 Navy Achievement Awards, a couple of Air Force achievements. And so, Kip, welcome, and I'm hoping that maybe you can share a story about why you might have gotten one of those awards in military or private industry.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for the warm introduction. One story I'd like to share is I received a on-spite award in the commercial sector. It was during the first time I had left the Marine Corps and started my first job. Well, in the Marine Corps, I used to teach information technology and information security. But when I retired, my first position outside of that industry was an entry-level security analyst. It's about 2003. The goal of the company I was working for is they were having some issues of securing their infrastructure, so they hired a bunch of entry-level security analysts that were monitoring intrusion detection logs. During that time, you kind of get a sense of habit of how systems communicate from each other to another, from a user base to a server, to a particular server, and you kind of monitor those things and understand what's going on. Well, this is about the time that Blaster came out, and I'm sitting there watching the logs, and all of a sudden what we ended up seeing was we saw cross communications between 2 workstations, and we're like, why in the world is that? And also, why was the communication going from not from one location but from multiple locations to continue on and on and on? The bottom line is what I ended up doing was we identified how the system communicated to each other, and what we started doing is blocking those services, trying to make sure that we isolated that particular virus. And how we did that was we used the IDS in a preventative mode that actually stopped that particular activity from happening.
So you've been in the industry for a long time, not to age you, but yeah, so today wanted to talk about threats to email. This is something you've spent a lot of time on, and what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and share a couple statistics that the industry has learned about these threats to email, and then maybe you can share some of your experience when it comes to solving these problems. So I'm going to cover kind of the 3 of the major threats to email in the industry today, and kind of explain why things are different now, that 2016 is a new era when it comes to email threats. In fact, the first threat, in fact, the number one threat for email this year is phishing. If you look at the graph along the bottom, that is the number of new phishing sites discovered per week as measured by Google. So when we look at the end of that graph, we see that 600,000 new phishing sites are discovered every single week. This is 3 to 4 times the number in any previous period. So 2016 is different when it comes to phishing. In fact, if we look at all the breaches over the last year or so, Verizon did an analysis and found that 92% of enterprise breaches over the last year were the result of spear phishing. In fact, Kip, I'm wondering if, given that statistic, if this seems familiar to you when it comes to what you've seen in the past.
Michael, so some of the things I've seen in the past is that there's a definite increase of attacks that are happening on specific organizations or specific companies. But what I've noticed in early, let's go back probably about 10, 15 years when email, actually even go back further than that, almost 20 years, we can go back when phishing was kind of a new concept because email wasn't really that well used 20, 25 years ago, and it's very heavily relied on today. Well, back then, what I noticed was a lot of spams would go out without really any specific driven intent to a particular organization or a particular person. It was literally sent out to a asterisk dot asterisk dot asterisk and went everywhere. Literally would just blanket a bunch of people. But if I go back maybe within the last 10 to 5 years in between that period all the way even up to today, particularly now, within the last year we've seen a lot of very focused attacks in the environment that says rather than me focusing on let me send it to a broad group of people, I'm now going to send it to a smaller set of people within an organization that happen to have a social media account that ties to a corporate account, or they say that they work there. It's not very difficult to determine what is the domain that you work for. For example, if we went out to Google, I'm going to go google.com or I'm going to go to gmail.com so that I can eventually get to all of the people at Gmail. But I'm not going to blanket the entire group of people. I'm going to start focusing on a smaller subset of people. And what we do this, and the technique that myself and Michael, you and I had been talking about this, was we came up with a phrase called Longline Fishing. And if you're a fisherman, what you kind of understand is that when you use a long line, you're looking for a specific type of fish. And what you're doing, and the analogy that I'm trying to use is that now I'm longline fishing because I'm now looking for a particular industry. If you look at the financial markets, or you look at the aerospace industry, or you look at a company that would contain a lot of sensitive information, for example, Target. How would you understand? Target.com. I work at Target.com. How can I get in there? And that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing the trend from a very broad perspective of not really focusing on a particular group or anything. It's asterisk dot asterisk. And then what happened is the migration went into a set of set of a particular group that the attackers wanted to attack, and then they end up going into spear phishing or to whale phishing depending on what the responses were in that phishing exercise.
So that makes perfect sense, in that now that we've taken spear phishing into the mass automated market, we're looking at what those attackers are seeking. And what's changed is in the last few years, it was all financial. but in 2016, we've actually found that the top spoof targets, or the information that they are seeking, is actually cloud credentials. So yes, they're spoofing the financial sites, the banks that you would assume, or the e-commerce sites, eBay and so on. But in 2016, they've been going after cloud credentials. And I think what we assume is that with cloud credentials, one, with single sign-on, your Google account might grant you access to multiple other services. Your Facebook account might take you to other accounts. Or, and this is very common, is that people use the same password for multiple accounts. So that's another thing that's changed in 2016, is that targeting of the cloud credentials. And so you've worked with a lot of companies, Kip, that have been compromised, and I'm wondering, after they've been attacked, what have you found?
So in companies that I've walked into that have been compromised, it really runs into a couple of issues. Is that I wanted to find out. Well, let me back up a little bit, Michael, because what I want to really discuss with the group here is not necessarily what I found at the moment, but you have to assess the environment. You have to understand what is your probability of compromise, and there's a lot of things that happen here. So what I ended up doing on these companies is I really wanted to get a sense of how did people respond when they received an email. So let me, Michael, and Michael, you really understand I like to tell stories. So let me tell this little story of a survey that I did, or a test that I did to evaluate how the company responds to phishing. So I'm at this company, I'm a consultant at this company, and they had been compromised. And though I had a separate team that was working on the discovery of everything that was happening post the compromise, or what led up to the compromise, I actually took another person and I said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to send an email out to not everybody, but break it down into smaller groups. And I want you to kind of give me an idea. I don't want to really know what the smaller groups result was independently. What I want is the aggregate of the entire company, and tell me what happened. Let me tell you how silly I really made this, and how gullible people can be, or people are really not paying attention. So what I ended up doing was I said, I want you to do an email, and I want you to make it absolutely the silliest thing that you can possibly make. And the guys came up with this great idea. And they said, hey, Kip, what do you think if we use a JPEG, and the JPEG has some malware? And I said, okay, not particularly malware, but it was a picture that would say, hey, this person opened it up. Or this people first would tell me if they opened the email and if they opened the attachment up. And once they opened the attachment, it says, you've been spammed, is kind of like a little joke. But at the same token, I had really good analytics. So the subject of the email was Hello Kitty. And in the body of the email, it was a picture. In the body of the email, it says, "Hey, take a look at my new cat." It was actually a picture of a cat. So when they picked it up, it opened it up, and some people deleted it, and we had the history on that. But what was interesting, and I've done this in probably 4 or 5 companies that I was a consultant. I actually did it in a couple of companies that I worked for. What was staggering is that 28% of the people clicked on the link. They clicked on the picture, which was incredible. That was the worst case scenario. The best case scenario, I had about 3 or 4%, but at the same token, I had somebody click on some type of malware.
That actually coincides with what Verizon found in their spear phishing analysis last year, in that I think 30% of people opened the email, and what they found is that across all companies, 12% actually clicked on the attachment. So I think that's true everywhere. So now that they've clicked on the attachment, I think now we can look at kind of the second greatest threat when it comes to email, and that is malware. I mean, it's one thing to click on either a URL or click on an attachment, but what we found, and I think it was John McAfee that kind of pointed this out last year, in that signatures are dead. 2016 has been the peak, and we can probably only predict it's going to get bigger, in that the attackers are using what are called malware factories, in that we are seeing 1 million new variants per day. So you might have a family of malware, but the factory will click out a new version of that, slightly different, so that it has a different signature or a different MD5. And the signature-based systems, at best, are catching less than half of all malware. In fact, a lot of signatures or a lot of MD5s only last less than a minute. And I think that's probably the reason why we're seeing this year a 600% increase in attachment attacks versus URL. It used to be the best way to get to a person was, or to get into somebody's mailbox, was to attach a URL. It's ubiquitous, and malware or antivirus systems wouldn't catch it. But the reason we're seeing an increase is the fact that the signature-based systems are no longer effective in stopping an attack because of the malware factories. And in fact, a lot of these attacks aren't using a vulnerability. It used to be that these pieces of malware used a zero-day. It had used maybe an Adobe vulnerability or something that needed to be patched in the OS. But what we're finding this year is that these pieces of malware are not using a vulnerability. They're actually using features that are built into the OS. In other words, they can't be patched. The OS can't be patched to prevent these. In fact, the only thing standing between a document entering the inbox and running on the endpoint is the user. The hackers have 100% access to the user's inbox, and all it takes is somebody double-clicking. In fact, Cisco just discovered a couple of weeks ago that there is a problem with one of Office's use of MIME types. Now, Microsoft a long time ago tried to solve the macro problem by moving everyone to docx, because a docx file won't have macros. Unfortunately, what's is that all they need to do is rename a .m or .docm or doc file that does have a macro enabled, rename it as a docx file, and because of the way Office uses MIME types, it will open the file anyway and allow that macro. In fact, this is probably the reason why almost 75% of malware this year were exclusively Office files. So that's kind of the state of malware today, and I'm wondering, in your experience over time, how is malware getting onto the system through email, Kip?
Well, there's three things that I've seen based off of history within the last, I mean, honestly, it's been ever since day one, was either there's a link that you're going to click on, there's a file that you're going to click on that contains malware. The link is a destination that says, hey, I just want you to visit it. Once you visit it, you're infected. And the last thing is they have to do something.
What do you mean by do something?
Well, let me, as you love my stories, I must tell another story. So it basically, when you do something, it's a lot of people have heard that I received an email, it wasn't an attachment, there wasn't a link, but it was a person asking for some type of level of information. And one area that I looked into on a compromise, because this was it eventually turned out to be a complete compromise of the system, but this is what we found out during the forensics and the research. a person within a company had received an email, and it says, and it was around the time that that you were doing year-end financials, which a lot of people have to play part in to make sure that they're going to deliver that information to the CEO, board of directors, or investors. So what happens is, one is the receiver receives an email, says, hey, I need to make sure that that these numbers are right. Can you please send me a spreadsheet? And what happens with there is that when we looked at the header of those initial emails, it would say to John Smith at testaccount.com, and I'm trying to make this as neutral as possible. I can't just divulge some of my customers, and what happened is that was the from address, the to address, and they're masking themselves of who they are, was to an actual person within that company. But when the person clicked reply, inside the header it said reply. There was a different address, so that when you replied to an actual address that the attacker would look at. Now at that point, you've established a relationship with the attacker, which is impersonating themselves as someone else, or a person impersonating someone that's in your company or a friend. Okay, and I'm using financials in a perspective for an inside of a company. Then the attacker says, okay, the individual sent me a spreadsheet. It's going to go to the attacker. The attacker is going to modify and add content onto that email, or did add content to the spreadsheet. And that spreadsheet went back to the user, and since the user says, hey, it looks, since he knows he's established that relationship, the victim opened the email, he looks at the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet looks 100% fine. It looks just as if he sent it out, and the guy just said he validated it. But in the back end, the attacker was deploying malware. And at that point, it's done. So my main point, Michael, in this and the audience, is that you can look at files all day long, and you can look at all sorts of different types of file by the naked eye and have no idea that you've been ever compromised. So the moral of the story is, we can't trust any file or link that's in an email.
So that's a pretty bold statement, and I guess because we determined that signatures are dead, I guess the question I have of you is, what is the solution? How do we prevent an attack?
Absolutely, signatures are dead. And it's what I'm seeing right now is that there's still companies that say, hey, I need to make a compliance and let me check the box, so I'm going to install a antivirus software, something that's signature based. Well, what I ended up doing, what I consulted on this one company, was you need to have a blend of solutions. Now, if you buy something that's behavioral based, a 99.9% chance they're going to check it against signatures anyway, so it gets out some of that information. But what I ended up consulting the companies on is get a sandbox. Check every file, every attachment, every URL.
In fact, you and I had a conversation yesterday about some recent attacks and how they were able to get by in a unique way. In fact, I think I even have one of the images there. This is actually actual server files, in that they are getting clever and clever about bypassing our perimeter. And the way they did in Cerberus case is that these are actual JPEGs that contain malware. And the way it was spread was this: the hacker would send a Word document that Word document would have the shortest of script, the shortest of macro, that would actually download one of these JPEGs, do an XOR on just a portion of the JPEG, and dump that to a file, rename it as an executable, and run it. So these images that you see here actually have buried in them an executable that no signature-based system would ever be able to find. The key thing is that it can only be found by looking at the original document, that macro, that and that might be the most benign of file. Like you said, that tiny little script can be added to anything. So in fact, speaking of Cerber, I think that kind of leads me to probably the third greatest threat, and what's new for us in 2016 is the rise of ransomware. In fact, we're only halfway through, and already it's been called the year of ransomware. One of the graphs I have here is the number of ransomware families discovered per quarter. Now, when I say families, what that means is that they might take a single family of malware and then alter it slightly, literally millions of times. But when it comes to families, there was one back in 2005, and really no new families until 2012, and in each case just one or two a year. What's happened in the last year or two is that we've gone from one or two a year to 20 or 30 or now 53 new families a quarter. In fact, 50% of all malware found on the internet is a ransomware variant. And a single campaign, a single launch, can generate 200,000 for the person who's spreading it, which is why we're having thousands of different campaigns, because we now this year have malware as a service. So you have a malware writer who creates this malware as a service, and then an affiliate will be the one that spreads it to different mailboxes, and they might use different techniques, different text, different subjects to get it into the inbox, but they split 60% with the affiliates, and the writers get their 40%. In fact, if you're an affiliate and you bring on another affiliate, they give you a 5% bonus. So ransomware, it's not a bunch of hackers, it is a business, a very successful billion-dollar business. In fact, half of US companies last year experienced a ransomware event. 30% of them lost revenue, either by paying or more likely just downtime. In fact, 20% stopped operation for at least a day in order to recover from the event. The reason why it's so successful and so prevalent is because 40% pay when measured globally. But in the United States, we found there's a pay rate of less than 1%. Now, of course, this number may be because of low reporting, but it's actually much, much lower in the United States. And I think, Kippy, you and I were discussing about why that might be. What's different about the United States when it comes to responding to ransomware?
I think the response is, responding to ransomware is, the United States is pretty good about backing up their information. Where your loss is you're not a complete loss of information, but what you end up losing is that time that it takes for you to recover, and that gap that was the last backup to the time that you have been compromised. One of the recommendations that I would say is that rather than worrying about decrypting ransomware, is you start to concentrate on what is your recovery mechanism for ransomware. As you can see on the slide, is you can contact all of the three-letter agencies. They're not going to have the key. A lot of these keys are randomized per deployment, meaning per system. So you would not have the ability to, feasibly decrypt your information. So the recommendation is backup, 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 backup. I'm hoping that by me repeating it a number of times, that you're getting my point. Michael?
Absolutely. In fact, no, I mean, I think you brought up a good point. You've introduced the idea that sandboxing is the only way to prevent it getting into the inbox. Signatures are dead, but also that once somebody clicks on something, once it gets into the person's inbox, there's nothing you can do about the malware. The only response is recovery. So in fact, that kind of leads me to our first poll. We'll have our second one later, but we're curious about what the audience has actually deployed for their email security. Are they using the default server or provider security? You know, what came with the system? What came with the service provider? Or are they paying a little bit more to add signature-based antivirus or anti-phishing tools? In fact, there are more advanced tools, the sandboxing that you mentioned, and kind of a new thing that's come out in the last couple of years, and this is this artificial intelligent predictive malware scanning. And that's something I think you and I might be able to talk about a little bit later. But I think in this poll, you can't choose more than one, so we're assuming that if you pick one of them, that you've got all the previous. So there's the result of the poll, and this is actually very interesting. That antivirus, of course, is the leader, and in fact, that's the checkbox. If you don't, you need to have antivirus. Anti-phishing, people have responded to the number one threat, and that is phishing. And I'm actually very impressed. This is actually a higher number than I would expect that I've seen, and that is that 25% of you are all using malware sandboxing. That is higher than the industry average. This is a very select group. And the 5% of you that are using the AI predictive malware scanning, I have to hats off to that, because that is the future. In fact, I'll go ahead and move on to the next slide. Kind of leading to you, Kip, about what can be done when it comes to preventing malware. I listed them off, but I'm wondering if you can kind of give us a history, Kip, about why we need so many technologies.
Okay, since you already uncovered that I've been in the industry for several decades, particularly 4 decades, I'd like to talk about a little. Let's go back in history. Let's talk about around 1980, very early 90s. I'm talking 1990 specifically. Well, there were 2 viruses that really come to mind back in the time when malware, it's been out there, and it was transmitted not by email, which is the majority of evolution. If they went from floppy disk to email, it's more efficient. It's a lot faster to get to people. But there were 2 things. One was called Stone. The second was called Michelangelo virus. And they did a wide variety of different things. Stone put a marijuana leaf on your screen, and Michelangelo, the best of my memory, would just shut your system down. So we said, okay, if these are the ways that emails are being brought into the environment, we're going to go ahead and block the floppy drives with anything that comes over on an executable. We're just going to block it. Okay, so at the malware, at the AV level, we would block any executable. Let me go back into the server perspective, the same thing that we did early on with the beginning of viruses and malware coming in. And what you end up doing in the server configuration, and it's still a best practice today, because it gets a lot of the initial upfront things that are happening on an executable sense or a malware sense that doesn't inhibit you doing business. So at the server side, you actually start blocking all your executables, your .exes, your .coms, your SCRs, and you're not, at that point, you're not blocking PDFs and Words, because that's how you work with business. As you move from left to right, what you're doing is you're anti-phishing. So you have an industry database with all of these phishing sites that have hit other organizations. It's called the blacklist. And you start blocking these things. Sometimes this is deployed on an on-prem solution, or this is a web-based proxy that will take care of most of that stuff for you. Well, continue on time, since AV has always been used since the early 80s, probably well before that, they were all signature-based, and they were slowly coming in. I mean, honestly, in the history that I remember back in the 80s and the 90s, we might have had maybe 3 or 4, that would come in a week. Now we're in the millions, absolute the millions. Now, since I can't block those particular file types, and now that I know that my AV signature-based AV is no longer worthless, I have to deploy a sandbox. Now, sandbox is going to go ahead and execute all of the individual. It's going to explode that file within a box and find out what it does. If it's something malicious, it's obviously going to block it before it gets to the user. But even as well as good as sandboxing does, there's still some things that some of the attackers will get through. Eventually there will have to be something else that will be invented, because the attackers get as smart. I mean, if you look at the 40 years or 34 years that I've been in IT and technology and security, you see that each time a user would come, or an attacker would develop something and it gets blocked by a particular product, it improves. But in today's standards, where you're looking at as far as best case scenario, where you're really addressing the problem and not doing a checkbox for compliance, is sandboxing and behavioral-based monitoring. Michael?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. In fact, this kind of leads to the next question. Is that's what you do in an on-prem system. You add different layers. But what happens if you move into the cloud? Because obviously the cloud's responsible for the server config. The cloud vendors have probably the industry's best database of anti-phishing, and when it comes to signature-based antivirus, they're all real-time databases. In fact, there is probably no desktop AV that is going to have as good a database as what's in the cloud. So, but you'll notice that we don't have the sandboxing tools, and I'm wondering, given that lack, Kip, would you recommend people don't move to the cloud, or what is your opinion about cloud versus on-prem?
That's a very interesting question, Michael, and it all depends on the company as far as if they're going to stay on-prem or they're going to go into the cloud. But as evolution in technology, it appears right now, and actually it's a proven point, that there are more and more. And I wish we had another slide on an earlier webinar that we had. It shows the statistics of where people are moving from where they are today to where we're going to go tomorrow. And it shows the natural progression is going into cloud-based services. Now, I think, do we have a poll or not that we can find out actually how many people on the call are using cloud-based services?
Yes, we do. That is the next one. Before we go into that, let's go ahead and introduce the next poll. And so, just to describe the poll to everyone, just asking who has moved to the cloud, or where is your mail? Is your mail still on an on-premise server? Have you moved it into your private cloud? You still manage it, but it's in your hybrid cloud data center. Or who of you have moved to Microsoft or Google for your mail? Or is there another email provider that is hosting your email for you? And so we'll let people answer that. And I think the answer to this will help us kind of have the conversation about whether or not or where people should go.
Wow.
And that is incredible. Okay. So
absolutely incredible. This is, honestly, Michael, this is, it proves to my point, is that the evolution of of companies is that you see a greater number of people that are in the cloud than that they have on-prem servers, which makes this a very valid point. That what are you doing right now for your Outlook 365? Now, what are you doing for your Gmail systems? Do we have it for cloud-based storage? But so what are you doing to protect your infrastructure? Do you have the same replicated tools within your cloud-based infrastructures? So what I ended up doing is there have been two companies that I've consulted for, that one was 100% cloud-based and another one was a blend of on-prem and cloud-based services. And the blend was they used Outlook 365, but they relayed everything from on-prem servers. So I had an interesting challenge to solve. And what I found out, Michael, in the research of looking at the technology, the time frame that it took to get the signatures up to date, deployed on all the desktops and everything else, I found out that when I relied on a cloud-based security service, I had a much quicker response time. Actually, I wasn't responsible for the response time. It was the vendors. And vendors have first-hand information that says, hey, I have some malware. I'm going to create a signature, or I'm going to create an anomaly-based analysis on it to make sure that I'm protected against it. So it's very interesting, because sandboxing to me is like the best of the breed right now. It really is best of the breed. I also discovered, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So I think let's move back to the deck, because I think we might be able to answer the question about if there are things that, if it's true that the cloud infrastructure is better when it comes to their server config and uptime, and they have much better anti-phishing and AV systems. I guess the question is, how are we going to add the layers of security that we had in the data center to the cloud tools where they might be lacking? And I think this is actually where we as a company, Avanan, actually do play a part as the sandboxing, and going even farther than that, and I think you just sort of touched on that just a little bit, Kip, is the new future technology of predictive AI. How do we get that into the cloud as well? So just to give you a brief introduction, just to kind of put things in context, I'd like to spend just a minute or two talking about Avanan, because the problem we just described in the fact that people are moving to the cloud, but there are layers of security that were once possible in the data center but are not possible in the cloud until now, and that is Avanan is a cloud security platform. What we do is we provide security for any cloud, and most importantly, any types of security. In fact, full stack security. We provide that not by creating our own, but we have partnered with over 60 of the major security vendors to offer that full stack security. The way we work technically is that we connect to the cloud vendor, in this case Office 365 Mail or Google Mail, via API. What that means is that we do not use a proxy. We don't use an agent. There's no appliance. Everything is entirely cloud-based. But then we are able to offer cloud-based versions of those security tools that you would normally deploy in your data center to offer that full stack security. And because we're in the cloud, we can do that instantly, spinning up a new service for security in the cloud. That flexibility not only gives us the option to deploy, for example, Kaspersky antivirus is another layer of signature-based systems, or checkpoint sandboxing in the cloud, but the more advanced predictive AI malware scanning offered by some of the new companies like Silence or Solbit. In fact, going beyond just email, again, offering security for any cloud, the ability to use the security tools from all of these different vendors, we can offer that malware sandboxing that you were describing, Kip, as well as that predictive malware detection, antivirus, anti-phishing, data leakage prevention, file sanitization, encryption, endpoint compliance, shadow IT detection, behavior anomaly analysis for the insider threat. In fact, that flexibility means that a week from now or a year from now, when there is a new threat and there's a vendor comes up with a new solution to that threat, we'll be able to add it to our platform. So I think, in fact, Kip, I do want to take a moment to remind ourselves about how we first met, in that we were at the RSA conference and you visited our booth and actually said there were two companies you were interested in, and one of them was Avanan, and I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about that story.
Oh, I love telling the story, because when I came back to Colorado, I started talking to a bunch of the CISOs in the Denver area, the Colorado area, about the tool. But what happens every year, or when I go to SANS, I look at what current technology is out there. Is it something that I consider that is front-end leading? There's a lot of companies, I will talk to the engineers and I'll talk to the sales reps, and they try to tell me exactly about the product. And you know, I only take what I'm interested in and what I see as a visionary in making sure that the product is something that's going to be valued in the future. And Avanan was one of the ones that I saw. And the reason why I saw Avanan as a front runner was I've dealt with a lot of companies that says, well, if you want to use my product, and we're only going to check it for a small subset of things, and you're only going to be relying on my particular product, I had to proxy it. But where I saw Avanan, where I saw Avanan as a front leader or a leader in the industry, was I didn't have to rely on a single vendor at all. I could pick and choose whatever vendor I wanted, whatever mix I wanted, and I would get the best value for my organization or for the organizations that I'm consulting on by using this product. Now, first off, I'm no longer blind in the cloud. I'm leveraging the security services across all of my cloud-based services. Now I have more of an assurance that I'm safer than I was yesterday.
Yeah, in fact, I think it was you that suggested that we introduce silence on our platform. We had obviously done pretty well offering sandboxing for the cloud, but it was your idea to add silence, the predictive AI, to our platform, and I think it was just a few weeks later that we had them on our platform. That's
interesting, because I didn't know. We have a lot of conversations, but it's good to actually see that, you know, some of the things that I'm talking about, it's actually providing value add. One thing I'd like to also mention is, with using a product that will allow you to look at your files, look at your emails before it gets to the user, you've taken out 90% of the problems. The rest of the 10% is actually educating the user or having something on the desktop that does that additional check.
So, Kip, I think we've got a few questions that have come up, and I think we're going to have Stephen come on and maybe ask you and I some of the questions that attendees have asked.
Okay.
Great, guys. So, hi everyone. This is Stephen Toole. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Avanan, and I'm going to be moderating Q&A here. There's a few questions that have come in. We've tried to answer some of them as they were coming in line. We'll answer some of the other ones now, and if there are other questions, this would be a good time to get those in the queue in the 10 or so minutes we have left here. So actually, one of the questions that came in earlier from Robert was about silence. So do you want to just talk about that for a minute, Michael?
Absolutely. So this kind of goes back to our philosophy that the best way to prevent malware is to block it before it gets to the user's inbox, because by then it's probably too late. So silence offers malware protection on the endpoint, while that means that if malware gets into the end user's desktop, silence can prevent it from going any further. And we recommend silence wholeheartedly. If you're going to have any sort of desktop protection, given that antivirus is limited in capability, silence has proven itself time and time again. However, silence does not offer a cloud-based version of their tool. We worked with them to take their same technology that works so well in desktop to offer it for the cloud to test files even before they get into the user's desktop, or in those cases in which people are using us for their file or other cloud-based service, checking all those files using the silence engine in addition to the sandboxing and the AV tools.
Great, thanks, Michael. Here's a question from Tom. It says, question for Kip. From your experience, what's the worst you've seen ransomware penetrate an enterprise? And then there's two other follow-on questions to that. How does it stop operations on a wider scale? He's saying here that he's only seen small instances in their organization.
My experience is very limited in ransomware. In some of the discussions, not actual events of analyzing what happened, it's I would agree with you. The only thing that the conversation I've had, it hasn't been widespread as far as larger corporations. I've seen desktops and laptops that were encrypted by ransomware, but nothing more than that. And when I looked at how ransomware was deployed, and that's the reason I had made the comment is backup, was I didn't see any way around to, other than sandboxing, and hopefully it catches in sandbox if it gets through and something absolutely does happen. That's the only thing I could see that you could possibly do to protect yourself. But go back to your original question: is that what have I seen in the industry? I haven't really seen it hit a large file server yet.
Okay, great. Here's another question from Matthew. Address backup to recover from ransomware. Question of preventing malware from entering backups, thus persisting after backup.
Oh, that's a great question. It's what we end up doing is I can only talk from experience of backups, not in backups of recovery of ransomware, but backups in the event of malware had penetrated a company. And where I saw malware that penetrated a company, and the attackers were in the infrastructure for quite a long time, what we ended up doing was, even though you have backups and you have newer technology that has been invented that would allow you to scan the files before they're reintroduced into the environment, it's the best you can do. And that kind of reduces the amount of malware. What we did find out was in some of the backups there was some malware that was still there that was backed up in the original thing, which actually addresses your concern that, yeah, it's still there. But as you go back towards the backups and you start going from day to day and then from week to week, you actually start to see that the tools that we use today are more intelligent and have the capability of cleaning the backups before you're reintroduced to the environment.
Yeah, in fact, that's a very common situation that we find, in that when we connect to a company's cloud services, and that could be their email, in which case we can not only see their current email but go backwards in time through their inbox, or their file services, go backwards in time to see the millions and millions of files that they might have uploaded over the last 5 years or so. What we find is that using the latest tools, we find pieces of malware that have been sitting there for years. And because we check every file with the latest set of signatures, check every file with a sandbox, or even now with the new advanced AI tools, there are pieces of malware that are lurking. So absolutely, before backing up and before recovery, everything should be checked as if it were a new file.
Great. A couple more questions here, and again, remind everybody if you have questions, please enter them in. We have about just a few minutes left. Ken's question is, do you see cloud environments as large targets for ransomware, i.e. Azure, Amazon, AWS, etc.?
I'll take this one, Michael. I don't see ransomware targeting large file shares like that. There's enough analytics and tools that are scanning. I think where you're going to find is within your cloud-based services like your Google, your Dropbox, on file storage. I think that what you're going to find is it's not going to infect it as you would normally see a file encryption, on your desktop. I think it's a little bit more difficult to go through from your desktop to your file share on the cloud. Is it a target? It can be a target based off of if you have it all depends on how you're configured. But do I see it as a target? I see everything as a target. I originally said no, but I don't think it is as large as a target as the user systems.
Yeah, in fact, what we're seeing is that part of the move to the cloud, and this is actually something we believe, is that the cloud for most companies is going to be safer than their own data centers. And there are a number of reasons why. One, they have a much larger staff, more advanced technology, and they're doing things at scale. So it's, in fact, the reason why email is so popular a venue is that the cloud-based vendors, they have secured the OS, they have secured their server networks, they have secured the application layer, they've secured and encrypted things at the data layer. So because they are doing things at scale, the hackers are no longer going after Microsoft's network. They're not going after Microsoft servers when the easy path is to actually go after users. So we actually see the growth in malware attacks as a sign that we've done a pretty good job of protecting the other avenues of attack. So it is very possible, theoretically, that someone could get into somebody's desktop that happens to be connected to your S3 environment and start encrypting that way. But again, the vector is going to be the user.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Another question from Robert. It's a brief question. I think we may have missed the context, but I think I can figure out. He said, can we select more than one? I think what he's suggesting is SaaS to protect with the Avanan platform.
Well, actually, I'm going to assume that there might be two different questions. One is multiple SaaS? Yes, of course. So if you have email, file sharing, Amazon, pretty much any cloud, but more importantly, any security. So you could actually have multiple AV vendors. So you could have a stack of, Persky or other AV tools, and then beside that, in parallel, have sandboxing. In fact, you could have sandboxing by more than one company alongside the AI vendors. In fact, because we're in the cloud, we can do everything in parallel, and so this, number one, eliminates any latency. There is actually zero latency because we're out of band, but more importantly is that if we've had those multiple layers, so if you are a hacker, a malware writer, you may be able to write a piece of malware that gets by every AV vendor. You may be able to write a piece of software that gets by every AV vendor and every sandboxing vendor, but it is going to be very much a challenge to write code that gets by so many different types of technology, because this is a business. If the expense of getting into your network is too high, they'll move on to greener pastures, which is why we always recommend having multiple technologies.
That's okay. I think that's all. Go ahead, Kip. Finish up that thought. I think that's about all the time we have after that.
Okay, real quick, in experience of using Avanan at one of the consultancies that I performed, was I actually used and showed the differences between a sandbox, a signature-based, and a behavioral-based, and showed those results to the IT department and the security department to say, look, here's how you can evaluate tools at a much easier way, rather than sitting there and say, okay, let me build a semantic server, let me go and put a Palo Alto firewall or a checkpoint firewall in my infrastructure. You know, building all these things out, it's already there. It's a click of a button. So I mean, I just wanted to bring out how easy it was for me to actually show the value add of using Avanan to basically just check a box and determine which is the best solution for us.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, Kip, and Stephen, for your great presentation, and to Avanan for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, you can visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.